In terms of this election, let's look a bit higher level at the US and think about what problems are we uniquely facing? What problems will the next president uniquely have to face and uniquely have to address? Samo, why don't you take a stab at that?
Well, I think whoever becomes president this election will have a very difficult job cut out for them, since the fundamental role of, say, the president and the executive branch has been breaking down over time. The US bureaucracies, and this includes government offices that are often technically housed in the executive, but also large economic entities, right? Large legacy companies, like think of things like Babbel in construction, or Boeing that we talked about last time in aerospace, or Lockheed Martin and Raytheon in defense. All of these large bureaucracies are breaking down, and it over time becomes harder and harder to reform them from the top. And historically, at least in the United States, when the US has seen a growth in state capacity, been very much led by the presidency, right? So if we think of everything from the US Civil War, the sort of Wilsonian progressive era, or if we think of FDR's reforms or Eisenhower, honestly, it's not just all in the progressive direction. Even if we think of the growth of US defense capacity under, say, Ronald Reagan, that again, spearheaded by the presidential administration, which of course is more than one person, but even the president team is finding it harder and harder over time to reform these bureaucratic structures because they're themselves centers of power. And like I said, this is a problem not unique to government. I think it's true to basically every institution that we can think of that was, say, functional back when the baby boomers were young, and now has become extremely bloated when the baby boomers are old. Anything you can think of that had its heyday in the 60s, there are very, very few institutions that are now working in the 2020s. So I think that's America's first problem. We call it metastasizing bureaucratic sclerosis. And the only organizations that really don't show this pattern are organizations that were founded much more recently.
Can we have a Javier Milei style president come in and try to get rid of it? Like, what is the likelihood that there can be real reform here?
I think it's a very good question, right? Because the reason, say, I'm not that optimistic about Milei is because I think Milei works in a context where it's a much smaller country. And in a way, the country's bureaucracy is very developed, it's somewhat powerful, but really the system is more dynamic and it's more open to external changes. Sort of like the bureaucracy is not that powerful, it's not that wealthy, it's not that large, right? It's only powerful in this like very local context. Milei can basically use a variant of populism and just being actually a wacky guy that beats the entire field of all the other people who might stand to be elected to his position. He doesn't have like that organized a political opposition. I think Milei basically have a very hard time running in the United States. And you could say that, but Trump originally in his first term defeated the Republican establishment first, so defeated the political party that is its own form of like oligarchy or bureaucracy. This is true of the Democratic Party, it's true of the Republican Party as well. But he didn't really take an axe to government at all. He didn't take an axe to any concrete institution. He didn't plan to replace it with anything. And note, these were ambitions of US president in the past. You had JFK threatening to smash the CIA into 1,000 little pieces, which of course didn't happen. His presidency was interrupted. And you had like similar aspirations to reform with the Nixon administration. And I think that it is picking one or two federal bureaucracies for real and just firing 80% of the people there, and perhaps then hiring, let's say 10% back. I think that would be a very radical agenda, but it would be a much needed agenda. So I don't think Trump's second administration, if he gets like a second term this election, right, I don't think he's going to pursue it because he seems much more comfortable with the sort of established Republican Party. And the established Republican Party might pay lip service to small government. It might pay lip service to effectiveness. Like the message has evolved a little bit from like small government towards something like a little bit state capacity, especially if you listen to people around J.D. Vance. I think they often speak of that, the need for government to do certain things well, especially in the area of national security, maybe even in the areas of technology and economic development. But I think there's very little evidence that that political coalition is happening. And then on the other side, Kamala Harris, the current nominee of the Democratic Party, I don't see the reformist reckoning be very active. It's not yet coming, right? The reformist reckoning inside the Democratic Party, I don't think we've even reached the point where Democratic Party politicians are taking a look and saying, we have these very like morally compelling arguments, at least we find morally compelling, about addressing inequality, about developing infrastructure, taking care of everyone. Well, let's ask ourselves, why are the public goods that the Democratic Party has prided itself on providing since the 1940s, such as public transport or things like public libraries, why are these things borderline unusable in large cities today in the United States? I think they've not had that reckoning, and they've not had the reckoning of just how much housing supply is constrained in the cities they control, like the cities that in theory should be naturally favorable to their control. They've not done a good job of governing and administering, and they've not done it in decades. And there hasn't been an awareness and awakening with that. I think there's only been, let's say, in the Elizabeth Warren circles, there has been a desire to punish corporate America, which is like, fine. I'm sure there's some stuff worth punishing. I'm sure there's some corruption, but there's no focus on making things functional, right? There's no focus on bureaucratic reform. There's like a left-wing version of reform, which you could say, actually, we should be providing these great public goods, and we should be ruthless with our own camp, because if we actually deliver these public goods, we'll prove to the American people that something like social democracy can work in America. So that would be like a left-wing, like actually radical proposal that could still result in bureaucratic reform. And the right-wing version maybe looks like Millet. You talk about small government, and maybe you axe the old defense contractors and give contracts to Silicon Valley defense startups, right? So that is both smaller government, but actually is also more efficient government. How much of NASA should be contracted out to SpaceX is a fun question, right? And I think that the more contracts SpaceX has, the more capacities the US has in space, both military and civilian. But I don't think the more contract Boeing has, for example, would achieve the same effect. So the right-wing version also has to discriminate within the private sector between companies that are functional and companies that are not. And it can't just be this revolving door of basically giving retirement plans and favors to the well-connected and to dysfunctional organizations that are too big to fail, that are perpetually bailed out. So again, there's a left and a right-wing version of this. And I think that the right is a little bit closer to making this a priority, as I mentioned in the sort of adjacent at the edges of the party intellectual space. And I think on the left, it's like the closest is the occasional Democratic leaning blogger, right? You could argue that maybe Scott Alexander would be in favor of this. And I bet Scott Alexander, votes Democrat. I don't know if he's ever gone on the record, but I bet he votes. He might even be a member of the Democratic Party, but he's a widely read blogger, but he's just a cranky blogger. And maybe we can name some others. Like I'm sure Noah Smith's like in favor of technocratic and positive reforms, and they're smart guys, but they're not exactly party insiders or party operators. The party insiders and operators, they're like, oh, all is well, right? And I think that's going to take decades to develop. So I don't think it's promising that the intent has developed to do it. Now, if the intent was there, and if it was sharp, it would still be a tough battle. You would be basically at war as a presidential administration with a large fraction of your own government, right? You would be basically going to bureaucrats and you'll be telling them, hey, I need a full accounting of what exactly it is that you guys do because I intend to fire 80% of you. Which bureaucrat is going to comply with that in a straightforward way? You have to do auditing, right? And where are you going to get the staff to do the auditing? And okay, well, I feel like the last person to really think about that very closely and carefully, I think that was literally Richard Nixon. And then again, question of like, I think the politics playing dirty aspect kicks in, where I do think the bureaucracies have means of striking against the president. Now, I don't mean direct assassination necessarily, right? But just, you can leak troubling information about the administration. Every administration has stuff that's troubling about them. And the business of government and the operation of American politics, there's always something that's corrupt. You even can't control everyone on your team. So the civil service is supposed to be impartial politically, but if their own jobs are on the line, then I think the government will prove suddenly extremely leaky to the press. And then these things might hurt popularity, right? I think that it's a surmountable challenge, but it requires, I think, awareness first among the educated American public. But secondly, the general public must at some point start voting directly on institutional competence, even more than party affiliation. Because I feel like this is a perfect two-valve engine where the Democrats mess up something and the Republicans say, oh, we just blame them. And then the Republicans mess up something and the Democrats blame it. And there's very little discernment. So the nicest thing I could say exactly about Donald Trump's second administration is that I think he still, if he is elected president, will still have that fight in him. But I don't know whether this, let's say, the educated opinion, and there does exist an educated subset of Republican Party thinkers and strategists, if they've come around to the view that the US has serious problems with regard to bureaucratic dysfunction, and that you can't just have a solution by giving more contracts to the comfy old big dysfunctional corporations that are doing business with, say, the defense sector or providing US infrastructure, that you actually have to bet on new companies. I think that leap, I think people in Silicon Valley are ready for that leap, but I'm not sure anyone in DC is really ready for it.
We mentioned Noah Smith. When I talk to him, one thing that he talks about is he thinks one problem that we have is we outsource too much of these functions to the nonprofit sector. It's like a massive nonprofit sector that is just doesn't have sufficient accountability. And he actually thinks we need to bring those functions back in-house into the government instead of outsourcing. We need to create stronger bureaucracies, paradoxically, to the Malay approach of like getting rid of these departments. Is any part of you sympathetic to that, or do you disagree even directionally?
Well, there's several things to be said here. I think nonprofits, the government outsourcing things to nonprofits just seems to mostly not work. The government outsourcing to for-profits can sometimes work, right? Like, it's clearly undeniable that SpaceX works, and it's undeniable that SpaceX would not have achieved its position without government contract. So it's possible to develop technologies, right, in this way. But providing services like social services, I think that the nonprofits are under so little pressure to perform and are such an easy way to misdirect public funds back into a form of political corruption, honestly, that it's just better we axe that. So I would agree with Noah to a great extent. I think maybe both of us living in San Francisco causes us to agree on this diagnosis. San Francisco city government has a budget comparable to that of small countries, and it mostly hands it off to a variety of nonprofits pursuing dubious programs with little evidence backing up their functionality. But all of those nonprofits then form kind of a power base for the city councilors and the politicians in the city, because the money can actually just circulate this way. So I think I want to just say it as it is. The US has a problem with straightforward corruption. It is much more like other countries than is usually comfortable to admit. A lot of these nonprofits are merely a way to give government money to a new container, and this container then dispenses it to sometimes the politicians or the politicians' allies or the politicians' backers who originally proposed the law or the outsourcing. So the US government in many, many levels has definitely lost control of many of the nonprofits it funds. So yeah, I think that if you're going to have generous social programs, they should be carried out by government employees, not farmed out to nonprofits, because the nonprofits have become a vehicle of corruption. Maybe that wasn't the case 40 years ago. It is the case now in at least California, but especially in San Francisco, and certainly in other cities around the country as well.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. If you're building a B2B SaaS app, at some point your customers will start asking for enterprise features like SAML authentication, skim provisioning, role-based access control, and audit trails. That's where WorkOS comes in, with easy-to-use and flexible APIs that help you ship enterprise features on day one without slowing down your core product development. Today, some of the hottest startups in the world are already powered by WorkOS, including ones you probably know, like Perplexity, Vercel, Jasper, and Webflow. WorkOS also provides a generous free tier of up to 1 million monthly active users for user management, making it the perfect authentication and authorization solution for growing companies. It comes standard with rich features like bot protection, MFA, roles and permissions, and more. If you are currently looking to build SSO for your first enterprise customer, you should consider using WorkOS. Integrate in minutes and start shipping enterprise plans today. Fast forward to the end of 2024. Think about your goals. What can you do right now to give yourself the best chance of succeeding? If learning a new language is on your list, you absolutely need to check out Babbel. Babbel offers a range of learning tools, self-study app lessons, live classes, and even podcasts, which have always been my favorite way to learn. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel isn't just a game to kill time and make you feel like you're learning a language. It's not overly academic or rigid either. It's all about learning language for the real world. Babbel stands out because it's designed by real people using a modern conversational teaching approach. It's not always easy, nothing worth doing ever is, but it's straightforward and designed to help you start speaking in just 3 weeks. With Babbel, I was able to brush up on my intermediate Spanish to ramp up for travel to Argentina last year, and was able to set clear goals based on how much time each week I wanted to practice. Join millions of Babbel language learners across all age groups. Here's a special limited time offer for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners, at babbel.com/zen. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/zen, spelled BABBEL.com/zen. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Curtis Yarvin has this sort of theology where he says every 100 years in the US, we've had a president that comes in and acts like a CEO and cleans house. Or FDR was last time we had this like major overhaul, and that we're overdue for another one. Do you think is there something instructive about this sort of theory of history? And do you think that is likely?
Well, I think that the timing, I'm not sure if he proposes it as a fixed theory, more so just an observation of US history so far. I would broadly agree with this version of US history because the government has been remodeled and renovated many times, right? The first time was when the Articles of Confederation were replaced with the Constitution. The second time could be argued is the Civil War, and then all of these other periods like the 1940s and the institution of basically the modern American state. People forget that this state, when it began its life, let's say in the 40s, right, with this current incarnation of it, it was just very functional. It could develop technology, right? Vannevar Bush was doing basically the equivalent of VC funding, of promising approaches to doing a whole variety of things. It could build bridges. It didn't even outsource building bridges. It just had a department that would build the bridges. It would, of course, execute complex operations like D-Day very easily. It would electrify large parts of the country. So in a way, it was a very functional developmentalist state. Now, the next time something like this happens, it won't be a rerun of the 40s. It won't be a rerun of 1860. It won't be a rerun of, let's say, the Constitutional Convention, because the society will be fundamentally different. I am optimistic in the sense that I think it is possible for a presidential administration to clean house. The question is, in a country that is still wealthy, it's just much less wealthier than it could be. In a country that's still powerful, it's just much less powerful than it could be. In a country that's still the frontier of technology and science, but it's advancing much slower than it could be. Where is the political will going to come from, right? I could imagine political will coming from a great crisis of some kind. Civil war was a trigger, for example. The other trigger was basically the Great Depression, then followed immediately by a major war. I don't see necessarily in the absence of such a crisis something quite as dramatic. I could see a more incremental approach where one or two presidential administrations make it their mission to fix completely broken and discredited parts of the federal government. And then the benefits to American society are huge, right? I think we are easily leaving economic growth on the table. Just consider how much wealth did inflation destroy just in the last 2 or 3 years. How much would it have been worth to have avoided that? Sure, the US is still richer comparatively to Germany now than it was pre-COVID-19. But where could it have been had some of these things been handled very, very differently? And very differently in the sense of not something outside of the scope. Even if, say, America's COVID policy was the same as Sweden's COVID policy, the economic damage would be lower. The money printing to cover up the economic damage would be lower. And therefore, wealth destruction, both from the headache and the martini we drank to forget the headache, both of those would be much less, right? They would be much lower. And I think the US really was hit with like a double hammer there. We misjudged the right public health policy, causing huge economic damage. And then we tried to inflate some of the indicators of that economic damage away, causing economic damage again. And I think both of those could have been better, right? So that's why I compare it to curing a hangover with a martini, right? So, but in the short term, it worked out, right? In the short term, you could claim that things were fine. The compounding cost of this is massive. So I could see a presidential administration not go full FDR, but go at least as serious in the space of reform as, let's say, Bill Clinton did in the 1990s. You could argue that Clinton in the 1990s was actually a pretty functional Democratic Party response to a kind of dysfunctional Democratic Party of, let's say, the Jimmy Carter era, right? Of like the 70s. There was this sort of third way, neoliberal globalization, welfare reform. Oh, actually, we're going to lock up a lot of criminals, but we're going to do it in a way that's progressive. That sort of thing could be seen as a corrective, but the situation is so much worse and the corrective is so much farther away that politically I want to see it from the Democratic Party, but I just don't expect it, right? So if that doesn't happen, if incremental reforms don't happen, we are piling up problems that we can kick down the road for decades, but that will then require a Hercules-like figure to clear out the stables of the mythical horses. It will be impossible to fix things incrementally. I think currently it still should be, but we might reach a point where it's just so fractally broken, where if you try to fix healthcare, you would like bump into education and bump into the pharmaceutical sector and valuations. Or if you try to fix student debt, you'd bump into all sorts of interesting problems, and it starts to become entangled. The dysfunction becomes entangled.
I'm going to create a thought experiment, which is, let's say that Trump wins, or well, either side wins, and they recruit us as their two main advisors, you specifically, and they say, hey, Samo, we go through a list of categories, and I want you to give advice on how you think I should handle that as president over the next 4 years. Maybe let's start with foreign policy.
I mean, in foreign policy, I think one of the first actions should be seeking some sort of, let's say, peaceful balance with China. So not completely retreating from East Asia, but ceasing to try to provoke some kind of war there. Because I think the US is not ready to fight a war versus China. We are nowhere near. We would have to rebuild an industrial base. If you look at a flow chart of all the inputs used by Raytheon or Lockheed Martin, when you drill into it, it ends up being like 80 to 90% Chinese suppliers. Sometimes there's like one or two American company in between, of course, assembling things, but there's a critical dependency on Chinese industry. So there's no real war with China, even a very limited one where, say, 200 or 300 sailors die instead of something that goes crazy in nuclear. We should instead reframe the competition with China to be a technological and economic competition first, and a military competition second. We should seek to outgrow China. So how might this look? I think, honestly, the defense side could be handled fairly well by merely striking a deal with Japan, arguing that actually the United States would like a nuclear Japan now, please. Something as simple as that is an immediate backstop to Chinese domination of Japan and other countries in a political or military sense, paired with an actual attempt to create basically a free trade zone for the United States. So create deals with existing American allies and move it towards something of an economic union. Don't expect institutions like the World Bank and all these institutions that China is now part of to actually stay under US control. Start building the US's equivalent to the European Union, right? We just have, they should adopt whatever the US regulation is on a topic, and they get to have free trade with us. And we get to do some friendshoring where instead of buying something from China, we might buy it from the Philippines, or we might buy it from Japan. But also all of American companies get to sell on the same level playing field. This will on net favor the United States because the United States will be the largest economy in any such hypothetical economic union. Now, it doesn't have to be anything grandiose. You don't have to call it an economic area. It could just be a series of treaties, but they have to be pursued systematically. And you kind of stitch together something that has these favorable economies of scale. So it's not, in a way, really a strategy of globalization anymore, even though it might sound similar. It's a strategy of picking off all the places that aren't China that have anything that matters and trying to integrate with them economically. Just a systematic decoupling from China. So that's foreign policy, but it inches into economic policy. The US should make priority very abundant and cheap energy. So what might this mean? I think we should open government contracts for very cheap nuclear reactors. And the very cheap nuclear reactors, we should have open bidding from new companies, but also from existing companies. Babbel can apply if they want to. Any of the other normal builders of nuclear power plants can apply. And in fact, I would go so far, assuming that some sort of treaty like the one we were discussing with South Korea is made with South Korea, I'll go so far that I would even open it to South Korean bidding to build nuclear reactors in the United States. And just make an issue of national security and override states and override local objection and just build up an extra nuclear power plant or 2 or 3 wherever there already is a nuclear power plant. So I'm calling something like an effort to build about 200 or 300 new nuclear reactors in the United States, on the assumption that if a location has a nuclear power plant, anything within a mile or 2 of that power plant is probably a fine location, and we probably won't cause too much damage and it won't be exposed to that much environmental damage to, I don't know, swamp slugs or birds or whatever. And we just actually say, no, actually, we don't care about the bird and we don't care about the fish and we don't care about the slugs and we don't care about the swamp in this exact location. We need cheap baseload electricity that is not dependent on any global fluctuation in fossil fuels. Now, of course, I would be in favor of even developing fossil fuels more to some extent, but then you run into the decarbonization argument and just sidestep the whole political fight and just bet strongly on nuclear. Solar, it's already taken care of as long as you don't make it illegal. It doesn't need more subsidies because the technology is improving. Nuclear is stagnating and it's expensive. And the way you would discipline the legacy corporations is that you open them up to South Korean competition, who currently are the people building the cheapest nuclear reactors. Like, I mean, you can open up to the French too, but the French are not going to be able to match the prices that South Koreans are offering. You just make sure it's not China, it's not Russia, it's one of the allied countries, and you make sure to open it up to new startups. And you give a directive to the Department of Energy that they have to approve just give an arbitrary number of new reactors that they must approve. They have such a backlog of these new prototype reactors they've not pursued at all. So the idea here is that you at least get relatively cost-effective nuclear reactors, you at least get cheap energy, but hopefully and ideally you get a new American nuclear industry that beats the South Korean and that beats everyone else, and you've provided a market for it. And I think it is not crazy to build out all of these nuclear reactors within 8 years, so 2 presidential terms, maybe 4 years of hypothetical Trump and 4 years of hypothetical J.D. Vance, right? That could work. Other countries have done similar things. China certainly built a comparable number of nuclear reactors over a very short period. So you can message this as actually this is decarbonization through energy abundance. And you can also message it as this is how we will prepare for the massive demands our data centers require. And we're going to do it without emitting more carbon into the atmosphere.
So, hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Hey all, Eric Torenberg here. I'm hearing more and more that founders want to get profitable and do more with less, especially with engineering. Listen, I love your 30-year-old ex-FANG senior software engineer as much as the next guy, but honestly, I can't afford them anymore. Founders everywhere are trying to turn to global talent, but boy, is it a hassle to do at scale, from sourcing to interviewing to on-the-ground operations and management. That's why I teamed up with Sean Lanahan, who's been building engineering teams in Vietnam at a very high level for over 5 years to help you access global engineering without the headache. Squad, Sean's new company, takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent so you don't have to. With teams across Asia and South America, we can cover you no matter which time zone you operate in. Their engineers follow your process and use your tools. They work with React, Next.js, or your favorite front-end frameworks. And on the back end, they're experts at Node, Python, Java, and anything under the sun. Full disclosure, it's going to cost more than the random person you found on Upwork that's doing 2 hours of work per week but billing you for 40. But you'll get premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost. Our engineers are vetted top 1% talent and actually working hard for you every day. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Head to choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
We talked about China. I do want to get into how do you think we should handle, just stay on the foreign policy side, sort of Russia, Iran, the Middle East in general. What are your thoughts there?
I think in the Middle East, I think it's basically like, don't invade Iran. There's no reason to invade Iran. If Iran if they went for a direct attack on Israel, then I guess the U.S. is obliged to respond in a certain way. And then, of course, Israel should be supported. But, just as in the case of Ukraine, it doesn't necessarily mean a direct war, right? In the case of Ukraine, the U.S. is not directly fighting Russia. It's instead giving ample weapons, supplies, and so on. Continue to try to support the development of countries like the UAE. So help some of the wealthy Islamic countries develop economically and help them ideally reach a situation where they're no longer quite as resource dependent on oil I think their societies are actually converging with Western values slowly. Let's say Saudi Arabia more slowly than UAE, but I think UAE is actually a modernizing force in the Middle East. The most fundamental trouble in the region is that so far, very few countries have achieved development. And because of this, there is an openness and a desire from just the general population to pursue different ideological solutions to this, right? In the 1960s, it was pan-Arab nationalism. You could argue this was replaced by Islamism. You could argue that in places like Libya or Syria, a lot of the strength of these regimes that I don't think were a big threat to the US, but certainly weren't friendly to the US, a lot of their strength lie in the fact that the democracies of the region didn't work very well, and that the other countries more favorable to the US were no less tyrannical at times. So a long-term trend towards development, probably emanating from the Persian Gulf, would be in US interest. For Russia, I think armistice is needed. I think a peace treaty similar or something close to a peace treaty, similar to the sort of ceasefire that ended the Korean War, is probably the best Ukraine can currently hope for. It's undeniably a defeat, but it's a defeat that could allow the rest of Ukraine to pursue economic development. And perhaps as part of the ceasefire agreement, push for the following compromise. Ukraine becomes constitutionally neutral. It does not relinquish its claims on the occupied Russian territories, but it agrees to not pursue those claims for now. It does not join NATO, but it is allowed to join the European Union, and that is protected, and the Russians have to commit to not interfering with any government that pursues a course to join the European Union. The result of this would be that possibly after the fighting stops, the border stops where it stops, there is a union with the EU for Ukraine. And it leaves open the possibility that when geopolitical circumstances change, right? Because truthfully, Ukraine, with US support, has done its best to try to defeat Russia, but it has not defeated Russia, right? So when geopolitical circumstances perhaps change in the future, if Western Ukraine is well developed and integrated into the EU, and a referendum is held, maybe not in Crimea, but certainly in Donbass or Mariupol or something like this, would not the voters choose to join a developing and prosperous Ukraine? I think they would. So even a Ukrainian nationalist could see a long-term peaceful opportunity for a reunification. And they can even cling to it. It's just, they don't have to be like, oh, this is lost forever. They can have it in the school curricula that these are occupied territories. Sure, in a way, it's a landmine that could explode with a new conflict. But in another way, I think it might actually be, it might save the country, because Ukraine is suffering immense economic and demographic damage as this war continues. It is exhausting itself over time. And to some extent, it was useful perhaps to blunt the Russians and to cause damage to the Russians in a cost-effective way for the United States. But in the long run, I think a stronger Ukraine is preferable to weak Russia. Let me say a bit more about what I mean by this. Russia is set to weaken just because of demographic decline over the next 20 to 30 years. It has also become economically surpassed by China. It is now economically integrated with China, which is unfortunate, right? Because of the recent war, significant trade with the West has been reduced. Some of trade still happens, right? Kazakhstan now imports many more ball bearings from the Western world and then re-exports many more ball bearings to Russia. So indirect trade like that, of course, still happens. But so many of the supplies and machines and resources that Russia once imported from Europe, they now import from China. So I think that the Western world should seek the development of integrated and strong buffer states in Eastern Europe. One aspect of this that I would perhaps support is that it would be in U.S. interest to support a closer integration of the Visegrad Group and the Baltic states. for two reasons. One, these are the most pro-US countries in the European Union. So strengthening them basically strengthens the pro-US foreign policy voice inside the EU. Secondly, strengthening and making these countries wealthier results in these countries being harder to conquer for Russia, regardless of what Western European support they receive or what US support they receive. So basically, let us create strong buffer states in Eastern Europe to deter further Russian aggression. Honestly, a Baltic Federation might make sense. Why try to stitch together 26 European countries into a superstate that could potentially become a US rival? Why not stitch together 4 Eastern European states to have like an anti-Russia coalition ready-made, one that's not bogged down by, honestly, the divergence of interest between Western and Eastern Europe? It's not really France or Spain or Portugal or Ireland or even Italy's problem if, say, Estonia is sliced in half. It definitely is Poland's problem. So I think acknowledging that reality and supporting the formation of perhaps a closer subunion there and encouraging its economic growth, I think that would be a very good policy for the United States and would do more to contain any Russian influence, because I think then it just has to give up on its ambition and it's long-term demoralizing. The contrast between this integration with the Western world versus the independent path Russia has charted, ideally the economic and the quality of life speak for themselves. And that's just starting to happen, right? You just have countries like Poland and Estonia and Slovenia to some extent ascend to this higher Western European living standard. And there are places where this has not yet happened, let's say in the Balkans. And that's one of the main reasons for, I think, the geopolitical intransience of countries like Serbia. So honestly, for Iran, containment, for Russia, develop Eastern Europe, cause it to be integrated, cause it to be more autonomous versus the rest of the EU, maybe even support countries merging, because why not, right? Or signing their own treaties that are independent of NATO, that trigger whether or not NATO does what it does. I think all of these would be solid approaches and would not give up on any actual US geopolitical influence. I do think the goal of regime change in Russia is not realistic. Putin has demonstrated that economic sanctions, now we know they can't even work in principle. And he has demonstrated that Russia is capable of fighting a war of attrition just fine. And in fact, their industrial and military production has been increasing over time, not decreasing. They're in fact building new factories. And they're in fact cutting out a lot of the corruption that previously existed in the Russian military. They appointed an economist head of the Department of Defense. He's going to be taking a close revision of all of these deals that caused their famous undersupply problems. So let's not do Russia the favor of fighting a war of attrition that gives it more state capacity. Let us instead go into, with as much as we can, the economic reconstruction and prosperity of unoccupied Ukraine. And let's freeze the border about where it is de facto, right? Where the soldiers are shooting at each other right now, and revise the question in 10 or 20 or 30 years.
I want to zoom out and let's say, okay, we've given some advice on foreign policy, some on energy. Let's say we had a few more hours with the president to be, and he said, hey, Samo, what else do you think should be part of my platform? Or what else do you think should be part of my most unique focus or most important priorities?
I think if it was possible, a big restructuring of the US Air Force. I just don't think we actually need jet fighters anymore. And that's going to be a big political fight with the Pentagon. We don't need manned jet fighters at all. And we should be developing very, very cheap drones. And actually, we should be building a lot of them. So that's one. That's already a big fight. You're going to make so many political enemies if you just try to kill manned jet fighters. You don't have to kill the current ones, just get a commitment. We're not going to build or develop new ones because they're an obsolete piece of technology. And you know what? If it turns out we're wrong 10 years from now, that's okay. It'll be very easy to backtrack, right? So we can still keep building the F-35, but let's just put something in writing that we're not going to do that again. That I think seems achievable. And let's put programs, again, open to new companies, open to new startups to build drones very cost effectively and importantly at scale. Why not cancel any additional orders of the F-35 and just ask for 50,000 drones instead? Instead of buying a few thousand planes, let's ask for 100,000 drones. So that's just on the defense tech, a very small update to the future of air power, because I think it's warranted. I think it's where air power clearly is going. In addition to this, or alternatively, perhaps just go and talk to SpaceX and ask them, hey, how would you guys like to be an aerospace company that provides air defense, not just orbital capability? Maybe they'll say yes. Maybe Shotwell will be interested. Maybe Elon will intervene and he'll be interested for patriotic reasons. And even if Shotwell's not. But I think another thing I would emphasize is the US political system is geared towards distributing federal programs, economic benefit across 50 states. That makes industrial policy really hard. Factories love being next to other factories. Factories hate being in the middle of nowhere. You must have all sorts of infrastructure to cost effectively ship things into the middle of nowhere. You can easily start new companies and suppliers in whatever city, town, or region already has a lot of demand for specialized machinery that other factories need. So I think the designation of 4 to 5 special economic zones should be an acceptable political compromise. In these special economic zones, again, if possible, and this would likely require support either from Congress or the judiciary, at the very least, you can order that a lot of the administrative rules, because often the civil service has this form of administrative law where the letter of the law says something, and then how this letter is interpreted by a regulatory agency has a whole bunch of made up rules that they've basically set up so that they are capable of achieving what they claim is this letter of the law. So this kind of administrative form of law, that could be suspended. I think could just be suspended by a presidential administration. Maybe there would be legal battles, fight those legal battles. Maybe something needs to be pushed through Congress, push it through Congress, whatever the means. Pick 4 or 5 economic zones, pick places that have good harbors, ideally already developed harbors, and just say, look, we're not going to trample on anything states are saying must be done here, but we're lifting all of this stuff the federal government said must be done here. And we're getting grants for the development of industry in these regions. So I would actually just put open grants, like the equivalent of X prizes. It's sort of like first company to build 1 million electric vehicles in special economic zone 1 or whatever gets a massive tax break or gets a big subsidy, or the government will buy it. Hey, if we're buying obscene amounts of corn and obscene amounts of cheese, government cheese stored in giant underground caves, I wish I was kidding. Like, that's literally what the US government does for dairy, okay? I wish I was kidding. Why can't we buy 1 million EVs? We could buy 1 million EVs.
I think that's the thing.
Right? Like every EV you sell to the consumer, we will buy an EV and we'll store it in the same cave with the cheese. I don't know, maybe it can drive the cheese in there. It sounds like an insane waste, but in a way, it's like way better, right? Because the consumer can look at the car, decide, okay, is this a shitty car? Do I actually want to buy it? And if the consumer decides to buy it, you're just like, oh, every one that the consumer buys, I'll buy one too, but it has to be drivable. So physically drive it to the cheese cave, please, and we'll store it there. It's the national EV stockpile. Yes, we'll use this after the bombs fell, right? The caves protect them from EMP pulses or something. You just tell a stupid story like that. It can even be true. It doesn't really matter. It's just, you have to reward companies that actually physically build stuff because the corruption problem is so fundamental. And if you have to do a few stupid things to make that happen, make it happen. But once that scale is built up, have these be timed out programs, however you do it, whether you're rewarding them for building factories in a special zone or you're rewarding them for output in that zone, whatever it is you're doing, time it out and have there be a set timeline when the regulations return. So in other words, create America special economic zones. Let us make American Shenzhen. We need an American special economic zone and an American Shenzhen to make silicon work again. So this is in the computer world, in information technology. The chip fab should be concentrated. The EV production should be concentrated. Just putting tariffs on Chinese EVs is like not really enough. And I think honestly, innovation in things like, have we really applied high tech to making steel the best it could be? Well, not really. So letting the old companies die and rewarding whatever company, old or new, with that has a lot of jobs or few jobs that can build 1 million EVs or can build 10,000 drones. I think that would do a lot to produce never before seen prosperity in these regions. At the end of the day, it's not that different from some of the efforts the US had with the Marshall Plan in Europe after World War II, or that it itself undertook during World War II to build out an economic basis for producing what it needed to for the war. So what I'm proposing is, let us build out that industrial basis as if we're about to fight a war, but not fight the war. And if you're going to fight the war involves not giving big corporations a lot of money for them to spend however they want, it involves buying a product that you're doing quality control on from these contractors, right? You need your 10,000 Spitfires to work super well. Okay, great. The Spitfires have to be built. They have to work. We're going to fly them against the Germans or whatever. Same thing with the 10,000 EVs that you can then drive into a cave. Or if you want, you can give them for free to like poor American. That's what you're into, right? Not very Republican coded, but you could literally do that if you wanted to. And then what you have is this immensely built out economies of scale. And like, I think American EVs would be competitive with Chinese EVs. Maybe subsidize exports to the European market, maybe just go all the way and fight a trade war with Europe and just bully Europe into accepting a proper free trade deal with the United States. I bet the US could achieve that, right? Like if Europe's having all these problems, maybe fight this kind of trade war with Europe and merge the European market with the American market. And sure, this might result in a few European companies doing well, but on that it'll benefit the US. And I think the European Commission knows this. But I think the joy of it is that you can go country by country. For starters, I think Britain that exited the EU would be very happy to have proper free trade with the United States. I think that would just shape British politics in a very good way. So anyway, we're returning again to the question of trade. And I think the idea is that we should not be seeking any sort of conflict with China, both for humanitarian reasons and because our production base isn't up to scratch. And I'm proposing, let us build a manufacturing base to rival China through any means necessary. And then let's surpass them. Like if we are truly more innovative, I think we need the opportunity to be innovative. We need the opportunity to both build things here and design things here. And that was something that was foolishly given up with the wave of globalization that shipped everything to China.
I think that's a good place to wrap this episode. Samo, as always, a great conversation. And until next time.
Till next time.